it's Kay from Crafting with Kay. How are we all doing? So welcome to my new segment called The Reading Nook. I reached out to an excellent author called Sharon Hannaford, and she gladly gave me permission to read her Hellcat series to you. She's one of my top 2 favourite authors of all time. I have a couple of mugs, so fill up a cup and drink and join us for the project. So, what perfect diamond painting to use? The little dragon reading a book, drinking a drink, cozying up for the night, ready to breathe for the evening. So grab a project, grab a drink, and listen along. Just a heads up, I'm not the best at reading out loud, so I will probably butcher some names, but please, I will get there in the end. But either way, I hope you enjoy this new segment. Take care, guys. Enjoy! Chapter 7. Claudia had been dispatched for another round of coffee and pastries, and Julius had given Gabby back her mobile phone and left the office, giving her some privacy to call Kyle and reassure him that she was all right. Gabby guessed Julius would stay close enough to hear her side of the conversation. The phone had been turned off, so she assumed he knew that she could be tracked via her phone. By giving it back to her, he was either confident she would stop them from coming to get her, or he reckoned he had enough time to complete their meeting before the cavalry arrived. She stood up cautiously and stretched out stiff muscles in her legs while she made the call. It took several minutes of reassurance to get Carl to calm down and not to come searching for her with every member of the SMV he could contact. She didn't bother telling him about her injuries, just that she had been ambushed and darted with something to knock her out, and was about to engage in a meeting with the master vampire of the city. Finally, to give him something to do, she told him to arrange an urgent meeting with the SMV Council for the following morning. She assured him that Julius had guaranteed her safety and that she would be dropped off at a place of her choosing before sunrise. She would call him from there to collect her. She wasn't letting vampires anywhere near her house or Kyle's. She didn't use her emergency word, and she hoped he noticed in his anxious state. They had long ago decided on a word that they could use in an emergency situation that would alert the other that they were speaking under duress. They had never had to use the ploy, but it was there, and she hoped Carl got the message and didn't try anything stupid. When she'd finished the call, she sank into one of the comfortable leather office chairs near Julius's desk, choosing the one that allowed her a view of both the door and windows, and waited for Julius to return. She didn't have to wait long. He arrived moments later with a second coffee and a bag of pastries, placing them on the desk in front of her and retreating to his chair on the other side of the desk. "So," he began, leaning back in his leather chair, looking at her speculatively. "How long do we have until they arrive to rescue you?" he asked, confirming her earlier suspicions. "What makes you think that I would need rescuing?" she challenged architecturally. "And in any case, I thought we were having a civil conversation, after which I would be safely deposited back in the city. Are you implying I have something to worry about after all?" Her voice was calm and precise, but there was still in the undertone. "Not at all. I have guaranteed your safety. You will not be harmed while you are here," Julius reassured her. "But I would imagine that the wolf was not too happy about our kidnapping you, and if I were in his shoes I'd probably be chafing to get you out of the clutches of a nest of vampires, and would do it by any means necessary." "Wolf may not always like my decisions, but he does respect them," she said. "He'll wait for my call." She left it hanging there, not specifying when she was expected to call Kyle. Let him believe that the cavalry was just a moment away if she didn't check in on at the required time. Though oddly, she felt she could trust Julius not to harm her tonight. If he had an ulterior motive, they didn't seem to include torturing or killing her, so for now at least she'd give him the benefit of the doubt. Nonetheless, she slipped her phone into her front pants pocket where she could reach it easily if she needed to. Julius wasn't the only vampire in the building, after all. "Now, can we get to the point of this meeting?" she finished bluntly, pain and tiredness washing over her. "Yes," he said, apparently satisfied that they would not be interrupted. "Firstly, would you be prepared to tell me what the connection you have to the Council of the Melis Venturi?" "I'm a hunter," she replied evenly. "The Council decide when a rogue needs to be eliminated, and the details are passed on to me or another hunter." "Yes, I guessed that much of the operation," he said carefully, "but I'm also aware that there is a deeper connection between you and a member or members of the council. "I'm not going to discuss that with you," she replied flatly, her expression clear that the topic was closed. Under no circumstances would she put Byron at risk. He was their most treasured and respected member and their most closely guarded secret. Only the council and the hunters and a few of this office staff knew his true identity, and they were determined to keep it that way. Other members knew his first name, but they were unaware of his real identity. They knew him simply as a voice on the phone that gave them their assignments, or called them up for emergencies. They had no idea that he was a respected member of the city council, a founding member of the S&V council, a born magus, and Gabby's second father. Gabby sat tensely waiting for the explosion, but to her surprise he simply nodded, a wary smile tweaking the corners of his mouth. "I guess that would be your answer, but I had to try," he said calmly. Gabby suddenly realised that he had probably read more than she wanted him to at her response to the question. She would have to be more careful with how she answered his questions. She also found herself wondering how he was even aware of her relationship with Byron, how he'd known where to find her and Carl tonight. This was something else she'd have to discuss with the council. It seemed they had a leak. "I need to tell you something of the vampire histories in order to explain our current situation. I'll try not to bore you with too many details, but please stop me if you feel I'm giving too much or too little information," he began, sitting forward and crossing his pale, long-fingered hands on the desk. She nodded her assent and picked up the fresh coffee, settling into the big chair and tucking one leg up under her, getting as comfortable as she could while still tense to react if another Genevieve barged through the door. As he started speaking, telling her the beginnings of vampire culture as it existed today, how the vampire cleansing in Eastern Europe in the early 18th century, and the so-called Age of Enlightenment, had decimated the strong vampire presence that existed in the world at that time, she found herself studying him in minute detail. A small part of her concentration started trying to analyse his voice, his mannerisms, the way he spoke. She was trying to place him geographically, as well as in a time period, intrigued with trying to work out where and when he was born. He appeared to be close to her age, her true age, of 29, maybe a little younger. He was well built and looked as though he'd had good nutrition growing up. She didn't know much about vampires, but she did know that their height and build was carried through the change. Although deformities, physical abnormalities, excess fat, hair loss, wrinkles, and skin damage were often repaired. Once a vampire had changed, they were stuck with their build and height. A short, skinny human became a short, skinny vamp, and a large, muscular human became a well-built vamp. She never encountered an older vamp with the muscle and build of Julius. However, for that matter, his power. Those born in the years before decent medical care, good nutrition, and gym membership were mostly on the short and skinny side, and appeared older than their human age. She had no idea of the exact correlation between power and age in a vampire, but she did know that the younger ones had far less mental power than the older ones, and her internal vamp meter always gave her an idea of the supernatural capabilities of a vamp. Julius was a very powerful vampire, but why he was so tall and so muscular was a mystery to her. The general consensus among the hunters about vamps was, be careful of the little ones. Julius was most definitely an exception to that rule. His accent was almost impossible for her to pinpoint exactly. He had a carefully neutral accent, probably English, but not one of the broader English accents. In fact, it reminded her of the accents of those from the British colonies, a clean upper-class accent without blatant inflection and slang, but also without the clipped pompousness of royalty. She could imagine him speaking several languages without altering his basic accent at all. Perhaps that would explain his neutral accent. If he had been around for as long as she suspected, then he'd probably learnt several languages and lived in several countries over the course of his lifetime. Then there was his name, she wondered. She wondered if it was the name he'd been given at birth, or if he had assumed it somewhere along the line. It was obviously a popular name in ancient Rome, but she doubted he was actually that old. Maybe it had made a comeback at some stage and become popular again, sometime in the more recent history. His build and colouring suggested an Anglo-Saxon bloodline in his background, but not knowing his exact age was making it impossible to be sure of anything about him. If he was aware of her scrutiny, he pretended ignorance, continuing with his chronicle of vampire history. He explained that the remnants of the Eastern European vampires had scattered into the rest of the world, many to Western Europe and the British Isles, but some adventurous ones took on the New World. They concentrated on keeping a low profile and quickly dispensed with any vampires who threatened to expose them again. For a while they shunned the company of humans, only coming into contact with them to feed, but there were so few vampires left that loneliness eventually drove them to resume the dangerous process of turning humans. Slowly, humans began rebuilding their decimated numbers, creating families for themselves. The first family of any note was one in Scotland in the mid-18th century. A female vampire named Helena had fallen in love with and turned a Scottish nobleman into a mate for herself, and between them they converted most of his direct family into vampires. Several of the older vampires latched onto her idea, and they also turned a number of other Scottish and English families. Ileana became the matriarch of the MacCallum clan, taking on her mate's name, and this blueprint for the new type of vampire family quickly spread throughout Britain and Europe. Vampires were now living a similar existence to their Eastern European heyday, but spread out in solid family groups, each ruled by a powerful matriarch or patriarch, known as a master vampire. The master vampire was expected to keep tight control over all members of the clan, enforcing secrecy and curbing vampire-related deaths, ensuring humans didn't learn of their existence. It was after a number of clans had been formed all over Europe and Britain that they began forming mutually beneficial bonds with werewolves and in some cases even magi and shapeshifters. Of course, over the past century the clans had started to become more like business enterprises than true families, he said. Businesses that employ the majority of the vampires and many of the werewolves in each city. Cities are regarded as territories, and generally only one major clan lives and rules in each city. Positions of master vampire in large cities are highly prized, and only the strongest master vampire gets to hold on to these positions. It has, in short, become a political game. He or she with the biggest influence and the strongest supporters wins. If a master slips up, there are numerous others waiting to take him down and replace him. Now the story had begun to interest Gabby. "So you're telling me you had to fight to be a master of the city?" she interrupted him for the first time. "Yes," he replied solemnly. "In more ways than one." "What do you mean?" she asked. "Well, for the most part, only the oldest and most powerful of us get to a point where we can challenge another master for a prime position. If we aren't considered powerful enough to maintain order in the clan, other masters will join forces to eliminate us as possible contenders. A master first has to prove himself strong enough and ruthless enough to control a clan before he is allowed to challenge." "Let me guess," she drawled. "You weren't considered old enough for the position." Julia seemed startled that she had reached the correct conclusion. She realised most people would have automatically assumed he wasn't powerful enough. She, of course, knew better. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I was considered too young by vampire standards." "So what are the vampire standards for a master vampire?" she queried. "Is there a certain age? A kind of test? What exactly makes a master a master?" She decided to push him and see how far he would go at divulging intimate details of vampire society. Any information she could gather was more than they had now. She was sure that Byron would find it fascinating. There aren't really any specifics involved. It has more to do with the mental power and strength, as well as the ruthlessness and experience in playing political games. A master is a vampire who reaches a point where they can do things that no other vampires are capable of. Such as, he continued as he saw the demand in her expression, not having to sleep through the daylight hours. Gabby felt her eyebrows shoot up at the piece of news. Not needing to feed as often, being able to mentally compel other vampires to do something, and having control over werewolves and other animals. He said the last few words with a discreet look at her, as if watching for a reaction. She felt her eyes narrow in contemplation and quickly concealed her interest by burying her nose in her coffee cup. "Go on," she said in a carefully neutral voice, filing away that enlightening piece of information for later consideration. "Not all vampires have the ability to become masters. Many can live to be 1,000 years old and not ascend to that higher level. It's something innate. The ability is either there or it isn't. Something like an alpha wolf. If you concentrate on the ability and have the determination to strive for the higher level, you'll eventually be able to dominate others. But if you're not quick enough, strong enough, powerful enough, clever enough, another will take you down before you hit the top. Survival of the fittest. Gabby nodded. It made a lot of sense to her once he compared it to the alpha's ability. What made you a master before the rest of them thought you were... She paused, looking for the right word. Experienced enough? I had, shall we call it, a certain advantage over others of a similar age to me, he said cryptically, leaving her to ask him the obvious question. She simply raised an eyebrow and waited, refusing to be baited. He bit off a slight smile and gave in. I have been able to compel other vampires to do whatever I want them to do since I was first turned, and I have a strong mental defense against the ability of other vampires. So in short, any other master with you in their clan would always be looking over their shoulder, wondering when you were coming for them, she surmised almost to herself. He smiled wryly. Yes, he confirmed. That's the main reason I was allowed to challenge for my own clan at such a comparatively young age. So, she took her eyes off him to study the pastry she pulled out of the bag and nonchalantly asked the question that was burning a hole in her. How old are you, really? He actually let out a burst of laughter, which startled her more than anything else he could have done. That is personal information, and not relevant to our discussion, he said. But I might be tempted to divulge the answer for some personal information from you in return. Gabby's expression turned instantly wary. Maybe another time, she said, her voice implying that he had about as much chance of that as a vampire had of surviving 5 minutes of full sun. A teasing grin touched his masculine features. You don't even know what I would ask of you. Aren't you even the slightest bit curious to know what I would like to know about you? The curiosity was gnawing at her like a million termites, and she had 1,000 questions she wanted to ask him, but she wasn't going to admit that to him. Are you going to get to the point of this meeting sometime before the sun comes up? She asked instead, stifling a yawn. Some of us do have work in the morning. Weariness was starting to make her crotchety, probably not the best attitude to have when trapped in a building full of vampires. The grin disappeared from his face. Yes, of course. I forget sometimes that others do not keep our hours. I will try to summarize this as much as possible. He took a deep breath, reminding her of another question to add to the growing list in her head. There is a challenger for my position as master of this city. This of itself would not normally be a problem for the citizens of the city. For the most part, fights of this kind of position take place only in the presence of a select few, along the lines of a duel at dawn scenario. They would rarely affect anyone in the contested city, besides the top-level vampires associated with the two masters. This case, however, is not a normal contest. He paused for a moment, as though fighting down anger, but before she could interrupt with a question, he continued. The challenger to my position is something of a radical in our world. He has not been approved by the other masters to challenge me, but they will not stand against him either. Gabby was confused. But everything you've told me so far indicates that the masters as a whole will not tolerate anyone overstepping their given authority. So why is the challenge against you any different, and why would this affect the rest of us? A number of emotions crossed his face as he looked down at the desk for a brief moment, and Gabby's heart rate jumped as she recognised unease and guilt as two of them. Abruptly, his face went passive, as he exerted rigid control over those emotions and looked back at her. The challenger has some unique talents and some unique allies, making him a virtual unstoppable force. The other masters wouldn't be overly distraught to see the end of me, as I don't play the political game the way that they think I should, and I'm too powerful for them to force me to play it their way. They're also hoping, of course, that once he takes the city from me, he'll be content to stay and play here rather than challenge them for their cities. If I defeat him, they're no worse off than before. If he defeats me, they believe he'll leave the rest of them in peace. So either way, they win in the end. They've decided to be Switzerland in this case, and won't interfere or assist either side. So spit it out, Gabby demanded. Why is he such a threat? Why are you all so scared of him? Julius looked her straight in the eyes. His biggest strength is the ability to control demons. He has the power over them like I have power over other vampires. He also has a magus allied to him, Gabby's blood ran cold as she knew intuitively what he was going to say next. She is one of the very rarest types of magi, one you would call a dark mage, one who can open gateways in the veil, pathways for demons to cross the void into our world. I believe he is planning to attack us with an army of demons at his command. Gabby sat in stunned silence. She realised the implications of this challenge to Julius's position without him having to lay them out for her. She already had a taste of what would be sent against him. A number of things clicked into place in her head at the same time. This revelation explained the unusual behaviour of the demons, their willingness to work together, the appearance that they had goals in mind, the sheer number of them appearing in the city. She tried to clear her chaotic thoughts, filtering things out that she could discuss with Byron later, figure out what other information she would need from Julius before her meeting with the council. The masters that make the decisions. The old ones, Gabby said. We call them the precepts, Julius supplied helpfully. All right, the precepts, she continued. You said they are adamant that secrecy is maintained? That it's one of the oldest and most unbreakable rules. If this contender... Dante, he supplied again. Okay, if this Dante is bringing hordes of demons across the city, it's going to be obvious that there's something supernatural going on here. You can't hide dozens of demons from the human population for very long. Why are they going against one of their oldest rules and letting them attack you? It doesn't make sense to me. Julius sighed broodingly. It doesn't make sense to me either, and I can't give you a straightforward answer to that. I can only surmise that they assume they can limit the fallout. Somehow keep it contained within the borders of the city, and later, once the dust settles, find a way to blame it on some other source. Mass hallucination, rabid animals, tainted water, something like that. They seem actually scared of him, of Dante. Their main concern at the moment seems to be keeping him from challenging the rest of them. They seem to think he'll be content with my city. They don't realise he has a much bigger plan in mind. They don't realise how much of a radical he truly is. They don't realise he is almost completely insane. Julius' voice had a morose edge to it. Gabby frowned. You sound like you have personal knowledge of him, like you know him well. I do, he confessed bitterly. I had the chance to kill him true death, and I didn't. He bit off angrily, leaning back in the chair and closing his eyes. She sat still in the ensuing silence, digesting the latest revelation. Then the common sense side of her kicked in. So what if you just simply stood aside for this Dante? Let him take control of the city. You could go off and find another city to challenge for. Why are you so determined to fight him? Julius didn't open his eyes when he replied. 2 reasons, he said quietly. Firstly, he will destroy life in the city as we know it. He sees humans as sheep or cattle, simply as a food source. He doesn't understand why we hide from them. He sees it as cowardly to live as we do now. He wants to live in a world where he is openly on top of the food chain, and the humans cower in his presence. He is humanity's worst nightmare come to life. He is what humans make horror films about. Secondly, it wouldn't matter what other city I took control of. He'd want to take it from me. He's determined to destroy me, as he knows I'm one of the few true threats to him, and he knows I'll stand against him in his quest for the new order of vampire clans. He sat forward now, looking at her again, his sapphire eyes boring into us. You and the Malus Venturi have 3 options here. You can try to continue to fight on your own to the best of your abilities. You can flee the city and save those that you love most. Or you can join forces with me and we can try to bring Dante down together. He stood up and walked around to stand in front of her. This is what I need you to present to your council. I will fight this war with or without you, but I know you have strengths that would be valuable to me. I think the best chance we have of bringing this city through this without major human casualties is to stand together. He paused briefly. If you choose to stand with me, and we defeat Dante, I will give the Malus Venturi my full support in the future. I will provide staff to assist you and information that will help you in dealing with rogues, and your protection of friends and relatives. Gabby stood as well. Though he still towered over her, she needed to bring them back to some kind of level. She moved to place the chair between them. Having him stand so close was playing havoc with her heartbeat, and she knew it had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the sudden surge of primal lust as she watched him move. It had been a while since she'd found the man this sexually exciting, and she was angry with herself for having those feelings for a vampire standing, looking pensively at her from the other side of the chair. She knew vampires could have that effect on humans. It was one of the weapons at their disposal to help them draw in their prey, but she always thought of herself as immune to that, as well as to their mind control. Maybe it was just a combination of her exhaustion and injuries that had her defences down. She fervently hoped so. She needed to get away from him before her body betrayed her feelings in a way he could detect. His eyes had taken on a speculative gleam, but he continued as though nothing had changed. "Is there anything else you need to know before you leave?" he asked, his voice deep and sultry, vibrating through her body. She deliberately took a deep breath, making a small groan when her ribs sent a sharp protesting rip through her side. Anything to curb her body's current desires. "No," she said through gritted teeth. "I think I have enough to take to the council. I can't tell you how long it'll take them to reach the decision, though. You'll have to give me a way to contact you." She felt herself sway slightly and gripped the back of her chair. Julius's face instantly took on an expression of concern. "Do you want some more of the painkillers, or shall I go get the doctor to look at you again?" He started to move around the chair towards her, his hands ready as though to catch her if she collapsed. Gabby waved him away and retreated from him again. "I'm fine, I just need some rest. I've had worse." Julius didn't look convinced, but backed off, giving her some space. "I'll give you a number to call. You can leave a message for me. We can meet in a more neutral place to discuss the council's decision. Perhaps a club or a restaurant. You are welcome to bring the wolf if you like. But I would like to keep it to just the two of you at the meeting. You name the time and place." "Can I trust you not to try anything stupid?" she asked bluntly. "Wolf and I will be armed, and we won't take kindly to being disarmed by a vampire." Julius sighed. "No, I won't try to disarm you or Wolf. None of my clan will touch you, and I expect the same of you and yours." Gabby looked sceptical. "You don't have any more Genevieves in your closet?" Anger flashed across his face, and his voice turned so deadly she had to suppress a shiver. "There will not be a repeat of that. I will make sure of it." He ground out through sudden extended fans. Then he took a deep breath and calmed himself. And speaking of weapons, he moved back to his side of the desk and in a single fluid motion opened a drawer. He pulled out Nex and two of her butterfly swords and laid them on the desk. "I believe these belong to you." Gabby's eyes lit up at the sight of Nex. Gods alone knew how that sword kept finding its way back to her, but she was unbelievably glad to see it. Her hand itched to close around the solid comfort of the hilt. She held her ground, waiting to see what Julius would do. He reached into another drawer and pulled out a piece of black satin. Gabby found herself wondering what kind of person keeps pieces of black satin in the desk drawers. He spread the material on the desk and carefully laid the 3 swords upon it and began wrapping them. "This is a truly beautiful sword," he commented as he carefully laid the cloth over the necks. "A one of a kind, and obviously bonded strongly to you. It is a priceless piece of weaponry. There are not many bonded Chris in the world anymore. The two of you are a good match." He finished binding the swords and looked up at her. "I hope I never come up on the wrong side of the two of you." His expression turned musing. "But it would be an interesting fight." Then he sent out a short spike of power. Seconds later, a vampire knocked quietly on the door. "Come," Julius called. Nathan, Liam's brother, entered the room. "Sire," he said, with his head bowed. "What can I do for you?" "Gabrielle needs to get back to the city. She'll tell you where to take her. I trust you'll ensure that she gets there safely." The deadly tone in his voice left no doubt as to Nathan's punishment should he fail again. "Of course, sire." He was practically grovelling now. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to make up for our previous errors. I will not fail you again." Julius picked up the black bundle containing the swords. He held them out to Nathan. "These are to be returned to Gabrielle in the car. Bring the car around to the rear entrance. I'll bring her down to you in a few minutes." Nathan took the bundle of swords carefully and bowed his way out of the office, disappearing on swift, silent feet. Great, Gabby thought. A few more minutes to keep her treacherous body from betraying her. The damned vampire exuded confidence like a pheromone. Maybe she could test the fractured collarbone this time. Julius couldn't help himself. That hint of sweet, musky arousal lacing the air earlier had called to him on a base level. It had been a long, long time since he had found a female this enticing, exquisitely tempting. He knew he had to have her, even if it was just to end the itch he could feel building deep inside his body. It would be an interesting hunt. He knew he'd have to be patient and cunning to seduce her, but it would be a delectable distraction from his current situation. The challenge was an even more formidable one, in that she seemed to sense when he used his power. She was down to his own natural charms to win her. The victory would be all the more sweeter that way, he smiled languidly. So have you reconsidered my offer to exchange personal information? He almost purred. It felt good to try out his rusty flirtation skills again. He'd never had much trouble attracting the opposite sex, even before he was turned, but it didn't hurt to know how to best utilize the tools he had been given to work with. He was rewarded almost instantly with the return of the scent he had been hoping for. Rape was definitely not his thing. He would only pursue a willing victim. This little cat was about to be stalked by a much bigger predator, for the little cat still had claws and teeth, and he figured she wasn't going to go down without one hell of a fight. "You're not that interesting," she declared airily. She could see her left fist clenching like she was driving her fingernails into her palm, and she broke eye contact with him. Julia's smile turned predatory as he reached down in the desk drawer again and drew out another piece of black cloth. He knew she wasn't going to like this one bit. "I'm afraid I need to bind your eyes on the way out of here, until I'm sure we have an agreement of some kind. I wouldn't want you to be able to find your way back here and do away with us all while we were asleep. You understand, I'm sure, just as you would not want us knowing where you and Wolf sleeps." Gabby's breath hitched in her throat at his statement. Julius was perplexed by the jolt of fear he detected rushing from her as he held up the blindfold, but as suddenly as it appeared it vanished, and it was replaced by a much more enticing fragrance, as though some other course of events had suddenly occurred to her. He filed that confusing snippet away in his mind, determined to discover its meaning eventually. He moved unhurriedly towards her again with the blindfold. She held out her hand imperiously, and he closed the gap between them. "Give me the damn blindfold," she growled. But as she said it, he saw the realization that there was no way she could tie it herself with one arm strapped in a sling. He saw the weary capitulation in her eyes and wordlessly moved closer to blindfold her. He leant over her and tied the binding firmly, but gently behind her head, tilting her chin upwards and touching her face to pull the fabric into place over her eyes, careful to avoid the healing burn mark on her cheek. Then he casually brushed a small dusting of icing sugar from the corner of her luscious mouth, which is currently fixed in a stern, annoying line. She jumped back from him as though scalded, haughty disdain on her face. "If you're quite finished," she huffed, "I'd like to go home for some sleep." Julius held his tongue as he took her hand in his and led her out of the office. She deliberately pulled out of his grasp and put her hand on his arm instead, muttering unintelligibly. Julius smiled enigmatically, the answer to his question drifting tantalizing off her body. The poetic words, "Will you walk into my parlour," said the spider to the fly, flashed through his mind as he led her down the corridor to the waiting car, and his smile grew wolfish. "See you next time. Bye."